So obviously, I don't know how old you are, and even if we were having this class in an actual classroom with me in front of you, I still wouldn't ask you. But if you're taking this course, I think it's safe to say that everyone taking it is at least 17 or 18. And because of that, I think the idea that cognitive development continues past what Piaget says will make sense to you because of your own life experiences at this point. On some level, you know that development and growth and maturity does not just stop at any point, no matter what kind of development and growth and maturity we're talking about. The term post formal thinking is all about what occurs after the formal operation stage is supposed to end, even if it ends at its latest point, which is about 20. Because it's at this point you begin to realize that real life situations can include complexities and issues and stuff that you never expected. And the reason that you realize this is due to pragmatism and reflective thought. All of which, again, sounds kind of complicated, but I'll explain it. Life can be messy, complicated, unexpected, whatever descriptive term you want to throw in there. Things do not always go according to plan. They do not always happen in the way they're supposed to happen. Problems, whether they're really big or relatively small, are not always solved by simple, straightforward solutions. By the solutions you know are supposed to work, which is why people often say life is like a roller coaster. And because of this, while we may try to approach the complexities of adult life the way we've been taught, in a logical and straightforward manner, because life can be complex, they don't always apply. As a teacher, when I'm talking about different theories, I often find myself saying, in theory, that works great, but in real life, not so much. Every single time I talk about communism, I make this comment because there's this common perception that communism is this evil, domineering political system that is horrible. Actually, true communism is the exact opposite. The problem is, while it works great on paper, in theory, in real life, it has yet to work the way it's meant to. So in real life, it doesn't work. This is exactly what I'm trying to say here, and this is exactly what pragmatism is all about. Pragmatism is about trying to adapt logical thinking to real life situations, to the constraint of real life situations. And the fact is, sometimes the two just do not fit together. Sometimes you have an issue. You're dealing with an issue or a problem, and the solution seems really simple in a textbook or in a theory, or when people give you advice. Just do this, it's not that complicated. In real life, the solution is not so simple. It's not so cut and dried. The logical solution that you know should work just doesn't work. This is what a pragmatist criticism of Piaget's formal operation stage is, resulting in the idea of post-formal thinking. That after formal operations, our cognitive abilities continue to develop because we realize that cookie cutter solutions do not always fit with real life. This is why Gisela Laboufi Fife says that part of the development that occurs during emerging adulthood, which is after formal operations have concluded, that part of what occurs includes more cognitive development because a person realizes that practically speaking, there are limitations to logical thinking. And again, she says they realize this after formal operations have concluded. Laboufi Fife says that this is something that does not exist in adolescence because at that stage, a person's more likely to believe that logic will always be effective. If you do something the way you're supposed to, or make a decision in the right way, everything's going to be okay. They are much more likely to be much more optimistic. Not in an everything will be okay kind of way, but in an everything can be worked out according to plan kind of way. And Laboufi Fife says that there are a whole range of social factors and contextual and environmental factors that often have to be taken into account to get through things, to solve problems. And this is true, isn't it? In real life as an adult, what we deal with is not always so neat and straightforward. I really, really like the example provided in the textbook of the married man who drinks a lot, and his wife tells him if he comes home drunk one more time, that's it, the relationship's over. I'm leaving. And then he comes home drunk again. In the example of research provided, they explain that adolescents tend to see this as a very straightforward solution. The husband didn't stop drinking, so the wife will now take the kids and leave, and the marriage is over. But the adults who participated in the study said, wait a minute, it's not that simple. It's not that straightforward. It's not such a logical decision. And they started talking about the factors involved, how the divorce would affect the kids, where would the wife live, where would the husband live, finances, how assets would be divided, what kind of custodial arrangements would be put in place, questions about child support and spousal support, all of the details that have to be thought of when a relationship ends, and especially a relationship involving children. I thought this was a really, really effective example of how difference in age, a difference in life stage, a difference in cognitive perception affects how a person thinks of a problem. And this is exactly what La Bouffe Fife meant. Maybe you've been in a situation where you have observed somebody else's relationship and they've had a problem. You think, oh my God, they're crazy to stay together because if I was that person, I would end the relationship. To you, it's a really obvious and straightforward situation. But then later on, at some point, you find yourself in a similar situation and you realize the solution is not as straightforward as you thought. There are actually a lot more things to consider than just walking out the door. Michael Bassick also focuses on post-formal thought, and he doesn't disagree with La Bouffe Fife at all, but he kind of takes the idea of post-formal thinking a step further than she does. And he says, look, girlfriend, it's not only that formal logic does not always fit with adulthood and what a person encounters, it's that formal logic rarely fits with adulthood and what a person encounters. So this term dialectical thought means that in emerging adulthood, thinking develops in which a person becomes more aware that most of the time problems don't have a single solution. And sometimes they have to be solved without unnecessary information. So La Bouffe Fife says, well, things don't always work the way you expect them to. Well, Bassick says, are you kidding? They rarely work the way you want them to. Not only sometimes, but often as an adult, you'll encounter an issue or problem that just doesn't seem to have a clear solution, that just doesn't have a logical and rational solution. So it's not just that life is a roller coaster, it's that life is a really, really crazy roller coaster. Often as an adult, you'll encounter an issue or problem that has more than one solution or that has different approaches. And these may be completely different solutions and approaches. Again, beyond the scope of formal operations. Culture might be a huge influence on this because generally speaking, Western societies tend to think in a certain way. So there's a difference between individualistic westernized cultures and collectivistic, more traditional cultures. Now, something else that's been found to increase after formal operations ends is something called reflective judgment, which is simply the ability to evaluate the accuracy or logical coherence of evidence and arguments. Sounds very scientific. What does this mean? Well, it means that when you reflect on something, another way of saying this is you take the time to think it over. You mull it over, you consider it, you wonder about it. So reflective judgment means that you think about the arguments you are presented with about something. You think about the evidence for those arguments. William Perry was an educational psychologist who specifically focused on the collective thinking of college students who would be in the emerging adult stage of their life. And as a person who meets and works with hundreds of different people the same age every year, I can really identify with what he says here when he states that for the majority of students in their first year and adolescents, they tend to lead toward dualistic thinking, which means they tend to see things in a very simple, black and white, either or, right or wrong kind of way. Another way of saying this is that they see things in terms of extremes with no in between. It's black or it's white, but gray doesn't exist. So they don't consider all of the little in particulars, all of the possible variables that may have an effect. Something is true or it is false. Not it is usually true except for, or it is usually false except in particular situations. This is in some ways a very optimistic outlook, believing there's always a right or wrong without the need for an in-between. So Perry says that adolescents and first-year students tend to lack reflective judgment. They usually don't possess the ability to really reflect on and consider how they're thinking, to really think about and consider the arguments they are presented with, to really think about and consider the evidence they're presented with. So for students in this stage of thinking, they would commonly be focused on memorize information instead of really thinking about it and learning it. They would be focused on getting the right answer. They'd want to know exactly what questions would be on a test. And if they encountered questions that didn't have a 100% straightforward answer, these would be perceived as tricky or unfair questions. What Perry saw was that in their late teens, the age when most people start college or university if they plan on going, multiple thinking begins, so late teens, early 20s. Yes, multiple thinking means that a person recognizes there can be two or more legitimate perspectives. They essentially recognize there can be two sides to a story, so to speak, and that each one is valid, that everything is equally okay. But multiple thinking also means that not only does a person recognize more than one perspective, they recognize that more than one perspective or approach can be true at the same time. So it isn't a situation of just realizing that somebody else's opinion may differ from your own. It's a situation in which they realize somebody else's opinion may be different from their own, but still accurate, that more than one perspective can be correct. So a student who has entered multiple thinking might wonder, how can the teacher evaluate their work if it's just a matter of opinion, whether it's good or bad? And multiple thinking is the first stage of reflective judgment, according to Perry. It then evolves into the capacity for relativism, which is one step up from multiple thinking. With relativism, the person actually compares the different points of view they are presented with. They truly evaluate the qualities of different perspectives rather than just acknowledging that different perspectives exist. So they realize that some things are supported by evidence and reasons, and that it can take more than just facts and data to make a good decision. And relativism then evolves into commitment when a person does just that. They commit to a perspective or view or opinion or approach that they think is the best. But they're still willing to reevaluate if something should change. They know that learning necessarily includes making choices. So, dualistic thinking is either or. Multiple thinking recognizes more than either or, and all options are okay. Relativism recognizes more than either or, but also starts to evaluate them. And commitment means a commitment to one perspective while still open to revision. So, and all of this, what it's saying is that reflective judgment tends to increase substantially during late adolescence and early emerging adulthood. Why? Well, one theory is people who pursue post-secondary education during these years tend to demonstrate more reflective judgment. And again, I don't find this surprising in any way because of what I do for a living. Post-secondary institutions, theoretically speaking, are places where people are supposed to be encouraged to think. to come to their own conclusions about whatever the subject matter is. Now, for the most part, I would argue that post-secondary institutions have almost completely gotten away from this, and instead, unfortunately, are often places where students are expected to just kind of spit back to professors what was fed to them in class. I once had a student who was in her fifth year in another discipline hand in her final exam to me in a second year course and tell me that the essay question in the exam, in which I asked students for their opinion, was the first time she had been asked for her opinion on a test in her entire 5 years at university, which I thought was absolutely shameful. But compared to immediately starting to work full time, a post secondary institution does encourage reflective thought much more than the typical workplace. So, being in college or university does in many ways encourage people to explore thinking, different ways of thinking, to think about thinking, and a wide range of topics in a manner a workplace usually does not. So it makes sense that people at this stage demonstrate more of this kind of thought when you consider how much of our population goes on to post secondary education.